by greed, pride, and power.
I think they could see that Brigham Young and all of the people in Utah, because of their ties to the church, they were a needed ally. There's no way that they could get the railroad built without the cooperation of the Mormons. It just would not have happened.
Brigham Young and his Kingdom of God in the American West found themselves between two competing forces who would do anything to gain 1 mile at the other's expense. Young's vision for the future of the Utah Territory would turn on his confident ability to outmaneuver the forces of American progress. The Union Pacific was actively courting the Mormon church leader. By telegram, UP power broker Thomas Durant asked Young if he could convince Mormon men to leave their farms and build the railroad line for the Union Pacific through the Wasatch Mountains of northern Utah.
April 22nd, 1868. There will be no difficulty in getting all the hands you want from $1 to $2.50 a day, according to their quality. Brigham Young.
Without missing a beat, Thomas Durant upped the ante, offering to forge a direct contract with Brigham Young.
Are you disposed to take a contract for a portion of all of our grading between Echo and Salt Lake? We propose to give you the preference on working near your settlements. Thomas C. Durant, Vice President.
By cutting a deal with Young, Durant thought he could monopolize the Mormon workforce. If Brigham Young was the contractor, the prophet of the Mormon Church would be doing the Union Pacific's bidding, and the Mormons would help the Union Pacific Railroad, not the Central Pacific. A contract would give Young the purse strings for thousands of jobs, extraordinary relief for his people suffering from the grasshopper plague, and work for hundreds of Mormon immigrants resettling in Utah. Within hours of Durant's telegram, Brigham Young was on board with the Union Pacific. With a signature, the contract was closed in May of 1868, and almost immediately Brigham Young used his church position to call men to do his work on the railroad.
To all bishops south of this city, I wish you to send me all the help you possibly can as quick as possible to work on the railroad. The pay will be sure and in money at liberal rates. Brigham Young.
It was done through a community and a church organization, and all of the farmers who really had absolutely nothing to do back at that point because of the fact that they'd lost all of their crops, just poured down from the hillsides to take advantage of this, bringing their plows, bringing their teams of horses, and ready to show up for a good day's work.
Young, as prophet and leader of the Mormon people, would personally guarantee jobs and pay for his followers. It was a guarantee that would haunt him for years to come. But in the summer of 1868, Young had little reason to question his contract with the Union Pacific. Almost immediately, Young sought to convince his assembling workforce that high wages were evil.
Men should not look for the wages that were made here in 1864 and 1865. The days for such prices to be paid are long gone, and it would be beneficial that they never return. Such high rates of wages benefit neither their employer nor the employee. They only foster extravagance and other bad habits. The Deseret News.
And that's what Brigham Young offered. He offered cheap labor, and he offered it at a price that would discourage the railroad from bringing in a flood of non-Mormon laborers. That was in many ways the worst of his fears.
The contract gave Young extraordinary power to take care of his people and his family, giving his sons preferred positions.
Notice, Misters Joseph A. Young, Brigham Young, Jr., and John W. Young left this city on the 8th, instant, for the head of Echo Canyon to let contracts for grading on the Union Pacific Railroad. The Deseret News.
Few in the Utah Territory would dare publicly question Brigham Young's management of the contract, nor his preferential treatment for his sons or ranking church leaders.
Wherein is Brigham's power over us? In our love and not our fear. We Mormon elders love our chief. He is our people's father, and we look upon him as such. Edward Tullidge.
For Young, his many hats were held forth as a defense mechanism to protect his people in a hostile world. In 1862, Congress passed the first in a series of anti-polygamy laws aimed at the Mormon Church. One key aspect of the 1862 law sought to strangle life out of the church by barring it from economic activity.
Brigham and his associates in the Quorum of the 12 assumed that the right way for Brigham to carry out the goals and programs of the kingdom was to leave some of the properties in his own name.
He began mixing the technical accounts of the church with his accounts as trustee and trust. And the term was a legal term giving him sole trusteeship over the financial assets of the LDS Church. But then he also mixed his own accounts with his accounts as the trustee of the church, his personal accounts.
In short, it was virtually impossible to separate the financial assets of the Mormon Church from the assets of Brigham Young, and it would prove to be a critical part of the story of the Transcontinental Railroad in Utah. Confident in his contract, Brigham Young time and again offered his personal guarantee for the work and the pay, as he urged men to leave their families and head to the work sites in Weber and Echo Canyons. By midsummer, thousands of Mormon men were carving a railroad bed through the canyons of the Wasatch Mountains. The Union Pacific felt it had beaten the Central Pacific to the punch in taking advantage of a Mormon workforce. But in the summer of 1868, the Central Pacific dispatched partner Leland Stanford to the Utah Territory to try and wedge a foothold between Brigham Young and the Union Pacific.
We have been pretty industrious, and it appears we may get help from President Young without waiting until he can man the work he has undertaken for the Union Pacific. Brigham has not got his men yet. The price he pays is not satisfactory, but he will get what he wants, and his followers will not work for anyone else.
Brigham Young started playing the Central Pacific against the Union Pacific, deftly reading the heated competition and the willingness of both companies to strike backroom deals to advance their cause. The leading figures of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific were familiar faces in Washington, passing around cash and railroad stock as they competed for an advantage.
They spread around a lot of money. It's just the way the government worked. You know, there was everyone benefited. The congressmen themselves, they benefited personally. They were sometimes given shares of the company. And, you know, personal financial benefit is a tremendous motivator for anybody.
We've always been on the defensive and have sought no particular legislation more than to sometimes endeavor to obtain the repeal of the obnoxious. If legislative bodies had let us alone, we would have been glad to stay out of politics.
The interest of the government was pretty much the interest of the railroad and vice versa. The capitalists pretty much ran the government. And that's what made America America. You can have whatever later political thoughts 150 years later that you might want. But the reality is that the railroad would not have been built if not for the interest of the capitalists.
But the brilliance of what happened with the Union Pacific, and it's a kind of a diabolical brilliance, is that Thomas Durant, the UP vice president, realized that you don't actually have to finish the railroad in order to make big money. And so basically what you would do would be you would set up a dummy corporation, and you would pay yourselves to build the railroad. So if you got $50,000 for a mile for construction and it actually cost $35,000, then you would be pocketing that difference per mile.
But scattered warnings of corruption and financial mismanagement were largely brushed aside by the anticipation of the railroad nearing completion. Central Pacific crews were on the Utah-Nevada border, ready to make quick work of the flattest stretch of the Great Basin. Before them was the Great Salt Lake, and a critical decision affecting the people of the Utah Territory. From the moment the Transcontinental Railroad had been approved by Congress, Brigham Young had lobbied hard for the rail line to pass through Salt Lake City.